Hi, everyone. Good, good afternoon, good late afternoon in the Netherlands, good early afternoon here in the United States, good morning if you are on the Pacific Coast or in Central Time. A very warm welcome to everyone participating in the webinar, joining this webinar. My name is Willemijn Keizer. I am the Executive Director of the Netherland-America Foundation. The Netherland-America Foundation is celebrating our 100 years in strengthening the bonds between the United States and the Netherlands. And we do that through educational exchanges for Dutch and American students and scholars, through sponsoring cultural exchanges, and by fostering business ties between our two countries. And this webinar, this very, very special webinar, is one in a series of occasional talks and lectures that we host on business, cultural, and historical topics. I am particularly pleased to present today's webinar on the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt, which we are organizing together with the Roosevelt Institute in Middelburg in the Netherlands. And the reason that the Roosevelt Institute and the Netherland-America Foundation wanted to organize the webinar is because Franklin D. Roosevelt, of course, is so well known, and among others is one of the co-founders of the Netherland-America Foundation. But behind Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there was also Eleanor, who was a powerful woman in her own right, who not only helped shape Dutch-American relations, but more importantly, international relations. Before I introduce the speakers of today's webinar, I would like to give the virtual floor to Damien Park as the Executive Director of the Roosevelt Institute.
Thank you so much, Willemijn. I would like to take this opportunity as well to welcome our distinguished panel and our guests from both the United States and the Netherlands, and a particular warm welcome to Professor Black and to Dr. Fatsi, our panelists. I regret that Ambassador Brandt is unable to make it today due to illness. We hope she feels better soon, but we were so happy that Dario Fatsi offered to step in last minute. My name is Damien Vargas, and I am the director of the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in Middelburg in the Netherlands. The RIAS is a research center and a graduate school that is formally affiliated with Leiden University, where I'm also a professor of North American history. The RIAS is devoted in particular to promoting the study and public understanding of American history and transatlantic relations. Our archives and some of our ongoing research projects focus in particular on what my colleague Giles Scott Smith has dubbed the Rooseveltian century, which underscores the legacies of Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, and Eleanor Roosevelt in the 20th century, especially as they relate to human rights. And so I'm very excited about this webinar today. It's a wonderful opportunity to host a live transatlantic event on such an important topic for both of our communities. But it's also so nice to work with our friends from the NAF in New York again. So thanks again to our speakers, our hosts, Christina Mertens and Marcella Schutte, and to Willemijn Keizer, Maggie Malone, and Jesse Conrad at the NAF for organizing this event. I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Damien. I too am very, very excited about this and very excited about the partnership that the Netherland-America Foundation has with the Roosevelt Institute. As Damien already mentioned, unfortunately, Ambassador Brandt is not able to make us today due to illness, but we are very happy that, that Professor Fatsi, Assistant Professor at Leiden University and senior researcher at the Roosevelt Institute is joining us today. I am very pleased and humbled to have Alida Black on our panel today. Alida Black is a distinguished visiting scholar at the Miller Center for Public Affairs. She also serves as the managing director of the Allenswood Group, a collaborative she founded to preserve and document women's political history and strengthen democracy through education and civic engagements. Alida has advised former Liberian president and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ellen Johnson Sirleaf on archival, oral history, and other matters since 2006. In 2017, former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton asked her to serve as her historian and advise her on archive, oral history projects, and other special initiatives. Alida received her PhD from the George Washington University, where she also serves as the editor emeritus of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project and is a research professor of history and international affairs. So welcome, Alida. We're very glad that you are joining us. The panel will be moderated by Christine Mertens and Marcella Schutte. Both Christine and Marcella are PhD candidates in American history at the Roosevelt Institute, and they are both enrolled in the Racial Democracy Project. So welcome all, and I will hand over the floor to you.
Yes, thank you, Willemijn. And again, welcome, Professor Black, and our friend and colleague Dario Pozzi from the RIAS. Christine and me are very excited to moderate this session on the lasting legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt. So Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the best known American women in history and the world, and she can be considered the very first modern US First Lady, because she was really the first lady who actively engaged into public discussions, but also into contemporary political debates. And so we basically know Eleanor as a community builder, as a politician, as an activist, as a world leader or a world traveler also, and of course also as a strong defender of liberal democracy, both at home and also abroad. So actually the very first question we have is, how important is it to revive Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy in today's world, and maybe also how truly known is her legacy, so both in the US and also abroad.
So I just want to, sorry. I just want to thank you both, because your work, your interest, your commitment to investigating racial democracy from an international perspective while focusing on the United States is, I would argue, one of the most critical intellectual challenges of our time. And it is also a profoundly Eleanor thing to do. But before I answer your question, my heart would disown me if I did not take a moment to thank and honor Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel for his extraordinary work in supporting and elevating the Netherlands-American Foundation, and also for his staunch, unwavering commitment to the Roosevelt Institute. Bill was had a huge impact on me, was the most gracious and challenging and daunting intellectual sparring partner I've ever had. And I just think there is a bleeding, gaping hole in the universe right now that this fine man who gave his life to human rights, refugee issues, international negotiations, and preserving the Roosevelt legacy is not here with us. But he is forever in my heart. And I hope that Bill would be affectionately sparring with Dario and me as we begin this conversation. So with that aside, my new friends, you asked me why basically we should care about Eleanor Roosevelt, and what difference does a powerful political woman who never held an elective office have on not only the history of the United States, but the status of today's world. Is that what you're asking? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, in 2 minutes, before Dario comes in, I will do my best to answer that question. There is not an issue in today's world that Eleanor Roosevelt did not address. Whether it's the issue of global poverty and pandemics, whether it's the issue of climate change and women at the peace table and conflicts, whether it's the centrality of voting rights, the politics of fear and division, the efforts to divorce parties, separate parties from party bosses, and encourage a more active, vibrant, thoughtful, non-hateful discussion of differences. Those are all the core of Eleanor's being. And she came to those slowly, you know, but once she got it, she got it. And she risked her life. I can document numerous assassination attempts, as well as hundreds of threats. She got the largest FBI file in American history prior to the assassination of Malcolm X for her work. But in today's context, I think that her extraordinary commitment to the United Nations while holding a mirror up to the UN and addressing both its potentials, its foibles, and its shortcomings is really, you know, her major strength. Because I just want you to think about today the despair that we feel about the increase in illiberal democracies, you know, whether it's Turkey or Poland or the United States or Venezuela, you know, or the resurgence of the Taliban. You know, there is an assault on the fundamental principles of humankind that undergird our attempt to build inclusive and effective governments. And so for Eleanor, you know, who understood immediately that the first UN was basically a boys' club, and that you had, you know, to navigate this in ways that held the world together is an extraordinary experience. So I want to give one example before I ask my dear friend Dario to join me. And that is, you know, now we are so immune to violence. You know, I mean, there's 9/11, there's what's happening in Afghanistan, there are stabbings in Europe, there are assaults on members of parliament, there are coups around the world, there are, you know, massive civil wars that have all shown up either on our living room televisions or on our YouTube and WhatsApp feeds. But when Eleanor went to the UN, the world had never seen this violence. We had come out of a cataclysmic world war with the most lethal, powerful, horrific weapons that turned skyscrapers into ash. And instead of leveling ground zero, it leveled entire cities, killing hundreds of thousands at the same time. We have 6 million people killed in the Holocaust. We have between 40 and 60 million people displaced throughout Europe. You have 40 million Soviets either killed in the war or killed by Stalin's purges. You have 500,000 Americans killed and numerous more wounded. We saw skulls used as paperweights. We saw bodies thrown into pits with lime eating their skins. This went around the world, and there was a fundamental decision for the world to make. And that is less than 17 years after the end of the First World War, the Second World War started with all of these horrific weapons and all of this devastation. Everybody with an IQ over 2 is afraid that World War III is around the corner. So we have a fundamental choice to make. Are we going to live in a world that is grounded in fear and distrust and anticipating increasingly horrific violence? Or do we have the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and take one step at a time, as Eleanor Roosevelt would say? And so what Eleanor Roosevelt saw the UN, and especially the Human Rights Commission, primal responsibility was to give that world a choice and to help encourage the world to choose a realistic courage rather than succumb to the politics of fear. And her unwavering commitment to that, the sacrifices that she made, the way she always learned to strengthen her argument, the way that she engaged with her fiercest critics, really is a model for us today on how we navigate violence, fear, and without sacrificing ideals and hope, and fundamentally understanding that compromise is good as long as you compromise up. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you, Professor Black. Dario, do you want to?
Brilliant. Yes, I mean, I agree, and I would actually take stock from these two words that are very important, I think, that Alida highlighted: courage and fear. And I think these are crucial to understand the modernity and the relevance of Eleanor Roosevelt in today's world. She was a fearless politician and a fearless human being, which is already something that we should teach our fellow democratic citizens to become. She was able not only to speak truth to power, to defend her ideas, which I found always admirable, but she was able to break the rules and establish new ones, usually for the better, in improving old traditions in ways that were always more inclusive. And I think this is something very important, especially if we consider where we stand today in terms of, you are part of a project that is called Racial Democracy for a reason, right? And I always admired Eleanor Roosevelt for this courage, because it takes courage, to go against tradition, to innovate. And, nowadays we live in a world in which for us, courage is, or bravery is measured with other things. The number of followers you have, the space race you are ready to embark on. But for her, courage meant primarily to empower people. And that's something that not all politicians are able to do. And I think she was able to do that. And the second reason why I admire Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think she's a very important example even today, is that she was a translator, sort of conveyor belt between people and the government. She facilitated the understanding of the working of democracy, which is crucial, because without that awareness, without that understanding, without the real knowledge of the role, the duties, and the power also that citizens in a democracy have, democracy simply doesn't work. And she was really committed in doing this, in translating into layman's terms, into layman's language, the inner workings of the UN, of the American government for people's safety, security, and progress. And the third reason why I admire Eleanor Roosevelt is that she, being not only a brave person, a brave politician, and a translator, she always highlighted, emphasized the importance of education. She was really keen on fostering mutual understanding. And this is something I recently had the opportunity to tell my students also. And it's very important in the Netherlands. I'm Italian, and I came to the Netherlands some 10 years ago. And one of my first encounters with the Netherlands was with these ideas, with this rhetoric, also a matter of national pride, that the Netherlands is established, is grounded on tolerance, that it's a very tolerant country. But there is a very beautiful, even though short, column written by Eleanor Roosevelt in 1947, which is exactly against the word tolerance. It was titled, "Tolerance is an Ugly Word." And I don't want to, of course, blame the Netherlands for this, but what she writes in it, it's crucial, because when you tolerate something, you usually don't like it. You let it there, but you don't really like it. You don't make any extra effort to understand it. And the invitation to understand things, to understand cultures, to understand people, which, you know, takes energy, takes an effort. You have to invest first and foremost on yourself, and then of course on your human relationship, is an invitation that I found always very deep, very profound, very impactful, very consequential, and unfortunately too many times completely unheard today. And that's why I keep admiring Eleanor Roosevelt.
Wow. Dario, that's fantastic. You know, I learned so much. It's bravo.
It's genuine. It's really genuine.
Sorry, we should tell the audience that we met several years ago once when Dario was writing his very first important book. We met in a very loud train station, and we have become faithful email correspondents. But this is our first resurgent conversation since the hours we spent in the train station. So I'm learning a great deal from you, my friend.
Indeed, indeed. And I actually have to admit that that conversation, you know, stuck. I really have vivid memories of that moment. And I remember that you were the one telling me. I remember I was just new to the study of Eleanor Roosevelt, and I asked you, as a well-established professor, as a person with more than 2 decades of experience of studying Eleanor Roosevelt, who was Eleanor Roosevelt? And you told me she was first and foremost a teacher. And I think you were right. She was like the people's teacher. Mm-hmm. She wanted to people to not to know, but to understand. And, you know, in an era in which we now live in this era where we sometimes sociologists or anthropology define it as the prosumer culture, where everybody is at the same time a consumer of culture and also believes to be a producer of culture, right? Because when we post something on our social media, we think we are creating, you know, facts, not really opinion. Well, in this era, it's particularly important to understand that there are people who may teach us something on how things work out there. And Eleanor Roosevelt was one of those people.
Yeah, and Professor Black, you also talked about her unwavering commitment, of course, to the UN. I actually wanted to ask a question also about her chairmanship of the Human Rights Commission. In that role, you already elaborated a bit on that. You said she sort of also had to make a lot of sacrifices. So she also struggled a bit with both her fellow delegates and conservative politicians who seemed to be putting national interests before the interests of the people. So my question is, so what were the struggles, political, ideological, and even personal, Eleanor Roosevelt had to overcome in order to achieve consensus on human rights?
Well, that's a great question. And I'd like to try to answer that in terms of first her struggles with the American delegation, and then what happened once she got on the commission, if that makes sense. First of all, she was appointed to the US delegation to get her out of the country. I mean, she was incredibly critical of Harry Truman by the end of 1945. He had not yet become, give him hell, Harry. He was being very inconsistent in his economic policies. You know, he would lift price controls, but not wage controls. He would lift controls on housing and not on wages. There were a series of wildcat strikes. Eleanor thought he listened to Churchill much more than he should have. And so she had become quite critical of him at the end of his first year. And so he basically put her on the American delegation to get her out of the country so that her national lecture tour would have to go on hiatus, and that she could go there and be a symbol. And Eleanor initially turned this appointment down. She thought, my God, you know, what am I? I'm not a diplomat. And her great colleague and assistant, Malvina Thompson, said to her, are you kidding me? You know, you've been in 2 war zones. You were in the war zones at the end of World War I. You were in the Pacific for 5 weeks in World War II. You know most of the leaders of Europe. Are you flipping kidding me? You've spent your whole life working on this. Go over. And then her son weighed in. And so she called Truman back and she said, Mr. President, I've changed my mind. I accept. But here's the real issue. Because of her popularity in the country, the Senate only had 1 vote against her. They were afraid to vote against her. And that 1 vote, I use this for your interest in racial democracy, was Theodore Bilbo, the arch segregationist from Mississippi, who totally thought Eleanor had black blood, therefore was communist, therefore shouldn't represent the United States at the UN, which he didn't support anyway. Okay, so the other members of the delegation did not want her there. You know, they thought she was a lightweight. They didn't consult her on any of the committee negotiations on and all of this. And in fact, the fluke of this is that one of her most vocal critics on the delegation, the Republican Arthur Vandenberg, who was sort of like the John McCain of his day, if you will, without the military experience, goes up to her when she's strolling around the deck of the boat going over saying, you know, Mrs. Roosevelt, we have decided that you should sit on Committee 3. She was the only member of the delegation who didn't get to pick her committee assignment. And she wasn't really sure what Committee 3 was, but she asked for all the briefing books. And Eleanor was the only member of the American delegation to read every page of every briefing book. So Committee 3, as I hope most of our audience understands, is the Committee for Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Concerns Affairs, which is really the home, if you will, of ECOSOC and the home of the what will become the Commission on the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So she debates Wyszynski in 1946 over the fundamental issue confronting the UN, which is the fate of displaced persons. Because the Soviets insist that people that are in camps under their control go back to help repopulate Soviet territory, even if they are not Soviet citizens. He has insistently brought this up in every committee and voting it down, but through a parliamentary maneuver gets it before the entire General Assembly. The boys on the delegation, as Eleanor would call them, were more concerned with the Security Council and the bomb. And so they were not prepared to negotiate or debate refugee issues. And so Eleanor out-debates Wyszynski, who was the Soviets' greatest debater. It's such a coup that it appears on the front page of Pravda in the Soviet Union. And as she walks out, John Foster Dulles, who was the most conservative member of the delegation, walks up to her and says, you know, Mrs. Roosevelt, when you were appointed, I thought it was awful. But I must say your work here and your work today has been fine. And we know that because she writes her protege, Joe Lash, and relates that conversation and says to him, so against the odds, the women move forward, but I'm very old to be carrying on this fight. So the first fight is to get respect within the American delegation. The second fight is to secure America's support for her election or appointment as chair to first the Nuclear Committee on Human Rights and then the commission itself. there was unanimous support for Eleanor to have that position, except for one country, and that was the United States. And so they did not voice that opposition officially, but they made it known. But there was such huge unanimous support for Eleanor to chair this commission that that she had to navigate her position, being fully aware of the Truman administration's hesitancy to endorse her, and also her full understanding of, as she would say to both Secretary of State George Marshall and Undersecretary of State John Lovett, the lack of attention or understanding that they gave human rights. So she's got to deal with that. Then she has to go in and deal with a committee that has the representatives of 18 nations that are universal in scope. They are not the Western nations. You know, you have India, you have China, you have Lebanon, you have African delegations that are floating in and out. You have Latin delegations that are floating in and out. And you have Soviet delegations that are there. You know, she's got to deal, none of them agree on anything except they beat the Germans. They don't agree on the concept of private property, what marriage is, if God exists, are children little grown adults that should be treated the same as adults, or is child labor illegal? What about religion? What about the right to travel? What about citizenship? What is the purpose of government? They don't agree on anything. And so her challenge as chair of the delegation is to really keep those conversations going in a way that keeps everybody engaged. And while, of course, they posture, that behind the scenes, the conversations continue. And then the final challenge that she had was to again partner with John Foster Dulles, the most conservative member, who went up to her after she finishes debating Wyszynski. But he's a Catholic, and he's passionately committed to the Catholic Commission on Reconciliation and Fellowship. And so she appeals to him as a Catholic to go with her to argue with Truman that social and economic and cultural rights are just as important as civil and political rights. And because of her ability to navigate that, she kept that disparate, very vocal, very smart, very political, and incredibly diverse committee united to keep the negotiations forward. But it was a struggle, which we can talk about in detail later, but I'm very much interested to hear what Dario has to say about this too.
Well, I have to say that I definitely recommend the books that you edited about Eleanor Roosevelt's years at the UN and at the human rights committees, because they are a fascinating reconstruction through documents and primary sources about exactly how difficult it was for her to make a role accepted in the first instance, and to make a role then working, you know, on an everyday basis with her fellow delegates, and trying to reconcile indeed different interests, different worldviews also. I would say that yes, indeed, she was asked to be part of the UN. I remember Truman writing to I think perhaps Senator Vandenberg, saying that he wanted to invite Eleanor because he needed the support of the liberals anyhow. And so it was like a political move. There was a domestic reason. So he did not want only Eleanor out of the country, which was sensitive, but he wanted also to, through her, to reach out to a more liberal public. And I think this in the end worked out. And I have to say that at the same time, I could not think of anybody else than Eleanor Roosevelt as a more powerful delegate on behalf of the United States in that committee. And it's very difficult to see throughout the history of the US and the UN another level of commitment, another level of high-profile appointment to the field of human rights. There have been incredibly good technocrats, very good diplomats, but such a huge investment in terms of public image on the part of the United States on the field of human rights. Yeah, it's, I don't know, I really have troubles in thinking something similar about Eleanor Roosevelt. So this is something. I have to say that, yeah, we may take it for granted today, in which we have a sort of bare minimum standard of what human rights are. But in those years, you know, even combining the idea, or even thinking about the idea of combining individual and social rights together, which meant combining, you know, two antithetical views of the world, capitalism and communism, was Eleanor's masterpiece. It was really an incredible achievement, which we all should study in order to understand that even things that seem impossible are indeed possible through commitment, passion, and listening to others. But what I feel it is also very important about Eleanor Roosevelt and human rights is the amount of energy that, again, she spent not only to achieve human rights, but to propagate them, to promote them, to make them public, known, understandable, reachable, concrete also, if you want. I mean, I always say that to me, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is important, but the speech about it that Eleanor Roosevelt gave at the Sorbonne in Paris a few months before the declaration was actually achieved is even more important, because it's a summary and it's understandable. It's not written, you know, with the language of international treaties and agreements. It's written with the language that students can grasp, and that's effective. And I think that that's one of our most important gifts to the world.
There's a great story behind that speech too. The State Department insisted upon writing it, and Eleanor said, "No, I will write it myself." And then they wanted to see it, and they tried to tinker with it, and they do that, and then she'd respond and all this other stuff. So she's at the Sorbonne, as Dario says, and Eleanor was fluent in French. None of the American delegation was. And so she gives the speech in French and changes the entire introduction to set the whole context of it in a way that that the State Department A didn't know about and B couldn't understand while she delivered it. So there was a little, you know, drama behind that too. I will say too that one of the things that Eleanor really grows to understand, and I think, Dario, you know, please tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I think her evidentiary trail is pretty clear, that she grew to see economic and social rights as the most fundamental of all, especially the right to food and shelter. Because as she would say, you know, without food and shelter, you worry every night if you will die or if you will starve the next day. And in that situation, hopes, fears, dreams die, and progress or democracy can't happen.
Yeah, I agree. Not only because if one looks at the story, the personal story of Eleanor Roosevelt, this is perfectly consistent with what she always said and did, you know, the kind of communities she helped to establish in West Virginia for miners in the 30s. There are places still nowadays in the United States that are called Norvelt, you know, out of her name, the Arthurdale Project. I mean, she was invested, and she invested a lot of time and energy in the protection of these version of human rights, which are the human rights that the people, the needy people are really keen on. But I think this was also what led her to transform this campaign for the achievement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into a political battle. Mm-hmm. That's why I think she hammered away at the necessity of having a binding treaty, because she knew that this kind of rights, social and economic rights, were the most fragile ones, that they needed enforcement, that they needed some, like an international bill of rights, as she said, because otherwise this kind of help, this kind of aid, the kind of things that people needed to, you know, be really free from want and fear could not be achieved.
Yeah, I think the record is very clear that for 2 of the 3 years that she was chair of the commission, she gave every ounce of her being while at the UN to really promote to draft what would be called the International Bill of Rights, or the International Bill of Human Rights. But when she saw that could not happen, she made a fundamental decision. She agreed to separate the declaration as a non-binding document, saying that lawyers will argue 3 years where to put a comma, and then to simultaneously promote legally binding covenants on economic, civil, and cultural rights, and political and civil rights. And it was, you know, a very controversial decision. I used to think she was wrong in my young, pure days. Now that I have worked around the world and seen what the struggle is, she was absolutely right, because the declaration is now used as a model for more constitutions and more founding state documents than the U.S. Constitution or the U.S. Bill of Rights. And I know you want to ask another question, so I'll shut up.
Yeah, I can already see some questions from the public sort of entering our chat. And one is sort of about her influence and also as a role model to Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama. And from Astrid van Heumen from Amsterdam, also, do we have a successor? So my question is, how important do you think people like Eleanor Roosevelt are today for the effective working of the UN, but also for the challenging future?
Oh, wow. Okay. Dario, you want to take that one, or you want me to take that one first?
No, you go first. I mean,
you coward.
Learn from you.
Okay. I think they're extraordinarily important. And before I talk about the women that you referenced, I want to talk about other women. In 2009, there was a conference that the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers put on with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the ILO, and Vital Voices. And it was to use Eleanor's simple vocabulary and negotiating skills as a way to empower 100 women leaders from 50 post-conflict nations to begin to discuss human rights in their own terms and how to find their own language and their own negotiation skills to go back and further the campaign for recognition of human rights in the most effective way. And the courage that those women had, whether they were from Rwanda or the Congo or South Africa or gypsies from Romania or from the Ukraine or Argentina or Liberia or Zimbabwe or any of the Balkan nations. you could see the courage that they took from her because she had no formal education. I mean, Eleanor had 4 years of school. I'm not talking about college or postgraduate or law school. I'm talking 4 years, period. And if you talk about the fundamental reason that we have a declaration is that every person is born with these innate, indivisible rights. It's a powerful statement for other women who risk their lives in the same way. So I think the negotiating skills and the clarity is incredibly important to today's leadership. I think that if you ask me who the successors are, I mean, I think there are numerous successors. I think, first of all, on the global stage, you know, that everybody knows, there's no doubt in my mind that it's former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. I mean, every day she gets up to think about women, peace, and security issues. Every day she gets up thinking about how to, what we should do to decrease, control, eventually eradicate the politics of fear. Every day she gets up thinking about what role the media plays. And remember that Eleanor, in addition to being a teacher, first and foremost was a journalist. And one of the reasons that she was so effective articulating her positions and really boxing in the US delegation is she understood how to use radio. She understood how to use a daily newspaper column. She was the third most syndicated columnist in the United States. She had a national lecture tour. You know, before there was PBS NewsHour or public television, you know, Eleanor had her own television show discussing public policy out of Boston. I mean, she was closely, with the BBC. She was closely involved with Radio Free Europe. So she got that, you know, and so there are fierce similarities. The also fierce similarity is they certainly, in addition to soul connections, if you will, and political connections, there's also an intense understanding of what it takes to do this work. The fierce emotional, psychological, and financial toll on you. So that, and then on country levels, they're extraordinary people. You know, there's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia. You know, look at what Malala did, you know, in Pakistan, and what an extraordinary contribution she's made to combating the politics of fear, certainly for girls' education, but placing that in a global context. You know, Mandela certainly took that further. In fact, when Mandela was imprisoned in Robben Island, one of the books that he asked to read was The Moral Basis of Democracy, which is, you know, Eleanor's great clarion call to the, you know, to the pre-war world. You know, there are people in Kenya, in Marsabit, Kenya, you know, nomadic leaders like Fatima Abu Dark-Haradan, who's, you know, the Horn of Africa Development Initiative in Afghanistan, and now relocated to Rwanda. You know, there's my friend Shabana Bassel, who founded the School of Leadership Afghanistan. So there are people around the world in their own countries that risk their life and their incomes to and their family safety to pursue human rights. So there's, to answer your question, I'd say there's Hillary on the global level, you know, Michelle Bachelet with UN Women, and now with the High Commission for Human Rights. I mean, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and women on an individual national level. But you got to give, you know, you got to take Eleanor off this icon status. Eleanor wanted people to work. And if people just looked at her as, I can't do this work, you know, she would be rolling over in her grave. Because as she wrote, the last sentence she wrote, other than a thank you note to Jacqueline Kennedy as she lay dying, was this: staying aloof is not a solution. It is a cowardly evasion.
I agree. Again, the thing is, I think Eleanor Roosevelt did not want to be an icon, did not want to be a symbol, but she was to a large extent, because of her family name, because of her personal story, because of her experience, and because of her character. You know, charisma is something that you have inherently in you, and it's also something that people recognize in you. And even though I'm genuinely convinced that Eleanor Roosevelt did not think of herself as a charismatic person, that there were millions of people everywhere in the world who realized that she had that pinch, that sort of thing that can drive people, that can motivate people, that can push people into action. And, you know, I've always believed in the power of symbols. For many years, I've been studying peace movements, and I've been always amazed at how, you know, a symbol that was developed in 1957 in London for a very specific campaign, which was the anti-nuclear campaign of that country, then became universally recognized as the symbol of peace. So much that students, when I tell that the real origins of that symbol, they can't believe it, because for them it's engraved in their DNA. It's the symbol of peace, but they never know why. What does it mean? What does it stand for? Eleanor Roosevelt transcends, in this sense, Eleanor Roosevelt herself. She became something bigger of her own life. And of course, these symbols, these influencers, we would call them nowadays, are important also for the institutions and the ideals, the principles they worked for and they worked on. And if you ask me, you know, every time that a student does their job, so writes a good paper and does a good research, every time that the civil servants dutifully comply with their own duties and tasks, every time that, you know, a mother prepares enough food for their children, then there is Eleanor Roosevelt. Then there is humanity, and where there is humanity, there is the great example of this character. If you ask me, a symbol of today would be to be looked for in the most, you know, in the poorest layers of our society. I can think of Emma Gonzalez, for instance.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The poor girl who witnessed a massive shooting in her school, and that had the courage to you know, speak truth to power again, and say that things had to be changed. Somebody who doesn't decide over their own destiny, but in the end are able to grasp their destiny in their own hands. Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt is there, and I think we need people like her.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe very shortly, because I know we have to wrap up soon. But I mean, with this whole discussion about symbols, and then we were also thinking, well, I know that Professor Black has touched a bit upon it, but maybe the crucial question: what was Eleanor's view on the role that women had to play on an international scale?
Well, in 1933, the first book that Eleanor Roosevelt ever wrote was entitled "It's Up to the Women." And I would say that was a major theme of her life, both as an organizer. I mean, she helped organize and was a major influence on the women's division of the Democratic National Committee. She was very involved in the labor movement and supported women in labor. She very much wanted women to run for office here and around the world. She played a major role in ensuring that women were represented in the post-war constitution that Japan wrote. Now, while she, I must address a little technical UN issue though. I mean, she very much wanted what's now the Commission on the Status of Women was then a Committee on the Status of Women. And she very much thought that should be part of the Human Rights Commission because it was although these are not Eleanor's words, you know, she saw women's rights as human rights, as individual rights, you know. But, you know, as she aged, she understood what that meant. And so she became, you know, a strong champion of the commission. But I think Eleanor would be euphoric that, you know, with UN Women now, that the head of UN Women is the assistant to the Secretary General. And I know without a doubt, as a historical and what if school of history, this sounds like to my fellow academics, if she heard then First Lady Hillary Clinton say women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights once and for all, Eleanor would have echoed that call around the world.
On that note, we are running up against time. Dario, did you want to say, I didn't mean to cut you off, I'm sorry. Did you
No. I mean, you have all the right to do that. I mean, there's nothing I can add. I agree. You know, I think that all the major progresses of mankind have been made possible every time that in this long struggle for empowerment, for giving women a space, we have been making a step forward. And I think if there is, you know, an engine for development that goes through and works through women and women's empowerment. So the sooner we understand it, the better it will be for everybody in the planet.
I couldn't agree more. This has been such an inspiring hour, and I feel so honored to have been able to spend it with you, Alida, and you, Dario. And thank you for the clarion call. It is up to the women, and I'm looking to Christine and Marcella as the new generation of historians that the Roosevelt Institute is working with. So thank you, Christine and Marcella, for the excellent moderation today, and I look forward to following you throughout your career. And thank you, Professor Black, for your tremendous presence today. I learned so much. This was such a gift to have you with us today. And of course, thank you, Dario, and everybody at the Roosevelt Institute to be with us today. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all. I had a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.